Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel, Ethical Considerations in the Anthropocene. The panel will discuss consequences of industrial animal farming and wildlife trade, construction of wildcats, and the work of veterinarians performing euthanasia. Although exemplifying very dissimilar practices, all papers share ethical considerations related to the classifications, distinctions, and hierarchies humans make between different kinds of animals. The panel will include 3 presentations, followed by a discussion and Q&A. You are welcome to write down questions and comments in the chat box during the presentations. Please write to who you are addressing your comment or question. The first presenter for this panel is Anna Schneider from Friedrich-Alexander-University.
All right. Thank you. So, hello, everyone. And again, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here again. And I would just like to take a very quick moment to thank everyone involved in organizing this wonderful conference, making this kind of international scientific exchange possible. I know there goes a lot of work in it. So thank you. And now let me jump straight into my presentation. As usual, there are many interesting points, I believe, but the time is limited. And so without further ado, save the species, question mark. Is it quite as simple as that, or are there more factors to consider that are very easily overlooked? Is saving a species or the species in the way of actually saving the individual animals? My presentation today will raise this question in a larger context, taking a look at the field of animal activism and concretely speciesism, symbolism, and spirituality in animal activism, while also drawing from one specific example in form of a wildcat shelter in Ansbach in Germany, and discussing different approaches, conflicting motives and interspecies miscommunications and understandings on a communal and in an individual level. Now, I would like to start the presentation by defining, for me, what we are even talking about when we mention the saving of animals or the saving of a species. And there are, of course, several interpretations of it, but most commonly, we understand the phrase in connection with the goal of conservation of particular groups of animals and/or wildlife. Conservation aims to save endangered animals from extinction, as well as guarantee the long-term survival of such certain species and often their habitats, and also what we define as their natural way of life, or as close as we can get to it. Talking about conservation, or what is sometimes also referred as to wildlife management, we have the question what saving or protecting a species or animals actually entails and how this can be best approached. Gamborg, Palmer, and Sandoz headlined this in one of the articles, asking really specifically, what should we try to protect? And traditionally, human society, of course, approaches animals looking for certain instrumental value, considering the use and therefore value of animals as a resource, economically or culturally. And coming from an animal activist perspective, this focus is on the name preservation of species or populations of, often wild, animals, animal welfare, and in terms of animal flourishing or suffering, or promoting also the health of a whole ecosystem, including its animal inhabitants. And while at first all these goals seem to be going well together, unfortunately, in daily operations of wildlife preservation, management strategies of institutions and caretakers, animal activist goals, charity and funding plans, conflicts between which interests to prioritize, and dilemmas between preserving a species or protecting individual animal welfare, those are unavoidable. As in other similar contexts, animal activists and protectors are facing the challenge of having to decide sometimes if the good of the many outweighs the welfare of the few. And now, while this paints a very rough picture of the challenging environment as a whole, I would argue that this is a struggle that often starts a lot earlier and often on a much more unconscious level. Animal activism and animal activists, no matter if more concentrated on animal rights or animal welfare, seek to reduce non-human suffering, value the life of non-human animals, and aim to improve the quality of this life. And while these goals are deeply admirable, the actual practicalities of approaches are facing similar challenges, however, as every human, non-human animal interaction. And that is the never fully avoidable anthropocentrist approach, as well as missing an animal perspective. And in the end, it is the humans deciding who needs saving and how the saving is supposed to look like. And ideally, the chosen strategies are informed by valid scientific research, critical reflection, and personal expertise. However, as animal activism is also based, of course, in voluntary work, it is by its nature limited and flawed by good intentions and insufficient funding and resources, may it be time, people, education, finances, and so on. Animal activism also never stands alone, but of course it is very heavily shaped, for example, by the society its members are part of, as well as its existing structures, political interests, communal development strategies, cultural components, and speciesist approaches towards different animal groups. And I would like to stay for a moment with the idea of speciesism in animal activism and the consequences and ethical dilemmas this brings with it for the work and affected species groups and members. While there's a strong emphasis on speciesism as the human prejudice or bias against other non-human animal species in favor of human interests, it also, of course, includes the treating of certain non-human animal groups as more valuable than others. And analyzing animal activist movements, looking for the most represented and supported animal groups, this tendency can easily be detected. While animals come in a huge array of types and species, protective movements still very often concentrate on groups, I would say, close to home, favoring mammals and other species that are comparatively easy to relate to. Consequently, the welfare of species assigned to other groups, for example, invertebrates, is very often overlooked or even denied. Why biological factors like genetic relatedness or similarities in social behavior encourage emotional attachment and empathy between humans and certain animal groups, these feelings are also influenced by sociocultural factors, most importantly, the meaning ascribed to certain species by society on political and personal levels. Starting at a young age with toys and children's books, followed by advertisements, news reports, or even documentaries, our idea of the nature of a species and the character of individual representatives of this species continues to be produced and reproduced. But even so, we have collected immense amounts of scientific data and knowledge about specific animals and specific species, their way of life and their needs. It very often still gets ignored in favor of pre-existing expectations. And this brings us to the double bind of often more socially than biologically informed images of species and appropriate treatments, as well as the additional challenge of having to deconstruct and check not just the idea of the species, but also question the applicability of these preconceptions to individual representatives of the species in real life. While this already presents a challenge coming from a well-informed scientific perspective, this task is even more difficult when dealing with species expectations that stray further from facts and are infused by alternative belief systems or imagined emotional components. I apologize for a second. My computer was not plugged in. To elaborate on this a little further, I would like to introduce a few examples from the mentioned case study, which took place in the Raubkatzen and Exotenasyl wildcat shelter in Germany during my PhD research 2018 to 2020. The shelter takes in wildcats and a number of other species from circuses and zoos when they are no longer able to provide for them or able to fulfill the minimum living requirements, but also actually most often from private households, directly or through police confiscations. And when I was going into the field 2018, my focus was mostly oriented towards direct or indirect human, non-human animal interactions. As a volunteer organization, the shelter's everyday management and the care of the animals is still run by a small number of semi-professional animal keepers whose salaries are financed through donations. Additionally, few individuals with limited training support their work, while most volunteers actually support the organization by taking on other tasks like organizing donation events, administrative tasks, taking on social media, and so on. And therefore, one of my interests was also to understand the motivation of these volunteers, who had very little to no direct interaction with the animals, but still invested a lot of their free time into this social engagement. During the interviews, you can see a few examples on the slide. During the interviews with the regular staff and volunteers, I first found what the hired animal keepers would call a major flaw in the organizational structure that caused several conflicts and even led to some of the staff leaving their jobs. Since the shelter was founded by the volunteers, they were also the ones forming the decision-making council, so to speak, that had the final say in any decisions regarding the running of the shelter and the care of the animals. Unfortunately, none of these volunteers have a specific background or any professional experience in animal caretaking or the running of such an institution, which led to ongoing debates with the caretaking staff about expected and actual needs of animals in the shelter's care. Very often, the volunteers would suggest adaptations or investments that were based onto lay knowledge about the animal species, infused very much by personal preconceptions about individuals. And as a result, the animal keepers would try to oppose these ideas by contradicting them with their personal knowledge from everyday interaction with the individual animals. And in my interviews and observation, I could identify especially two main categories that shape both the volunteers' motivation to participate in social engagement, as well as their generalized ideas of the animals' characters and needs. First, a number of volunteers refer to the wild and exotic character of the animals. The main interest was shown towards the larger wildcats, the tigers and pumas, which were described as elegant, wild, majestic, or independent. The animals obviously symbolized certain character traits some of the volunteers were aiming for, or seeing into them a reflection of their own. And this symbolization went so far that it was often reproduced, clothing or jewelry, also tattoos, such as animal prints on t-shirts, pictures on lockets, etc., but also through private collection of posters, books, and so on. In one case, one volunteer even created statues of wildcats as sellable art on the site. And the volunteers would literally wear the symbols on their body and recognize the connected meanings as the species, or in this case, the comprehensive wildcat categories characterization. It formed a very clear picture of fascination with the exotic animals. However, unfortunately, it neglected scientific facts or knowledge about the individual animals' personalities. And to fill this void, a second trend, so to speak, could be identified, which I subsume under the category of spirituality. Several volunteers reported a special connection with either cats in general, wildcats, or certain species like the pumas or even individual animals in the shelter. In many cases, this connection had roots in their childhood, explaining their fascination with these animals and leading them to their work in the shelter years later. Individuals would talk about dream communication, protective totem animals, and conversations with the animals in the shelter. And interestingly, even so, some volunteers shared stories about very special connection with previous animals in the shelter, which had, in some cases, passed in the meantime. They also confirmed now having, again, new special relations with other members of the same species. In the same way, and also overlapping with a very symbolic perception of the animals in their care, the experienced spiritual connection made the humans feel very connected to the species and to individual representatives, while having actually very little knowledge about these individuals in their care. And in some ways, the strong feelings of meaning and connection seem to actually hinder attempts to learn about the individual animals' characters and to get to know them in real life as well as their needs. As a consequence, the human-animal interaction becomes in some way one-sided, and the animal perspective is drowned out by the social preconceptions of the animal idea. Interestingly, the animal keepers in the wildcat shelter showed a very different approach. While social constructions could be identified, the regular interaction with the animals, the experiences of different moods, illnesses, conflicts, and so on, led to an awareness of the animals as individuals with individual and differing needs. And so the constant interaction, the symbolic character, and potentially projected relationships were replaced by genuine experiences and real-life interactions. Unfortunately, these real-life connections are not guaranteed in animal activism. They cannot be, especially if it concerns non-local engagements or engagements for animals in the wild. Going back to the beginning, saving and protecting animals is very often informed by a socially constructed approach towards certain species sharing our environment, and it's interwoven with a number of conscious and unconscious preconceptions and expectations on the personal level. The individual animal as part of the species may, as a result of this, as well as the previously mentioned challenges and limitations, actually be overlooked. It is therefore even more important, I believe, to have human advocates or almost translators that can represent the animal needs scientifically, but ideally also individually, drawing from zoological experiences or observations of and or relations with the animals. Additionally, a critical lens has to be applied to the role of media, policy strategies, and other social influencers to activist organizations as a whole, but also individual activists. They have to reflect their own role, preconceptions, and expectations for the purpose of the animals. This enables, I believe, a much more hands-on approach, potentially asking for a closer observation of the usefulness of certain campaigns for individual animal represents, instead of summarizing them under species preconceptions and possibly failing to reach the maximum improvement of their life. Having said this, I would like to conclude this presentation by actually recognizing, of course, the nonetheless very impressive social engagement and contribution of the animal activist volunteers as a whole, but also those I had the pleasure of meeting during my research, who have to really balance numerous interests, often financial difficulties, and of course, very many other challenges in their everyday work. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anna. Our next presenter is Rimona Afana from Kennesaw State University. Rimona, you can share your slides.
Hey, do you all hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you. I don't have any slides. I'll just be following my presentation notes. So given the time constraints, I'll only share a small portion of my paper. I begin with an introduction to large-scale animal use and abuse. Then I discuss why we should treat wildlife trade and industrial animal farming as a continuum between ecocide and genocide and not as legal and necessary economies. And the final part of my paper, which I will have to skip, is a reflection on death, dying, killing, complicity, and grief. So industrial animal farming and wildlife trade are victimizing billions of animals every year. And these two appear to me as the main organized forms through which we confine, exploit, torture, and massacre animals. Genocide and ecocide in this case often manifest as a continuum when we look at these two forms of normalized theriocide. And I chose industrial animal farming and wildlife trade as illustrations for my discussion of the ecocide genocide continuum because of their massive scale, their normalized cruelty, and the wider ramifications for nature and humanity. So I will start with some basics on wildlife trade. Wildlife trade is a massive global phenomenon. Some of it is legal, other forms are illegal, often embedded in transnational organized crime networks, some which are also involved in drug, arms, and human trafficking. Wildlife trafficking is the third largest type of illegal trade after drugs and weapons. And the illegal and legal trade in living and dead wild animals and plants is estimated annually at hundreds of billions of dollars. Though both plants and animals are traded, I will only discuss here non-human animals since my interest is the suffering of sentient beings. As documented by wildlife criminologists and various state agencies, hundreds of millions to billions of freeborn animals are yearly abducted. They're held captive in horrific conditions. They're tortured, maimed, and killed. Wild animals are used for their meat, for their skin and fur. Their organs are used in so-called traditional or alternative medicine for their supposed healing properties. And here are some examples globally are pangolin scales, shark fins, and tiger bones. Their body parts are collected by trophy hunters or turned into jewelry such as rhino horns or elephant tusks. And of course, entire animal bodies are collected for taxidermy. Many live animals are used in medical experimentation, such as primates and rodents. Others are held in captivity for life in zoos, circuses, private exotic animal collections, and so on. Particularly here, we find felines, reptiles, birds, and primates. It seems to me that defining wildlife trade is not death, because that would feel natural and inevitable, but killing instead, whether deliberate or out of negligence or ignorance. Besides causing the suffering of billions of sentient individuals, legal and illegal wildlife trade also threatens the collective, contributing to the extinction of species and to ecosystem collapse. Wildlife trade is a major threat to biodiversity. It's the second greatest threat to species survival after habitat destruction. And with now over 1 million animal and plant species threatened with extinction, wildlife trade is a prime contributor to the environmental crisis. I would try to contextualize the magnitude and cruelty of the victimization of freeborn animals with just one example. Pangolins are the world's most trafficked mammal. Over 1 million pangolins have been abducted from the wild over the past decade. 20 tons of pangolin body parts trafficked every year, mostly from Africa to China and Vietnam, which are the primary consumer markets where pangolin meat is considered a delicacy because of its rarity. And pangolin scales are used in so-called traditional medicine, of course, without any scientific proof for their so-called biological healing properties. The pangolins are protected in most of their countries of origin and under national legislation, and they're also protected internationally under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, the CITES Convention. Pangolins continue to be trafficked, and today out of 8 pangolin species, 2 species are listed as vulnerable, 3 endangered and 3 critically endangered. Pangolin trafficking shows us that the reductionist anthropocentric way in which laws and jurisprudence conceptualize non-human animals, their use, abuse, and suffering is out of touch with the scale, cruelty, and ecological ramifications of current practices. Despite the legal protections pangolins supposedly enjoy, they're now threatened with extinction in the wild. It's for this reason that I believe concepts like ecocide and genocide more accurately reflect the realities of animal victimization. I'll now turn to my other example, industrial animal farming, which also embodies this continuum between genocide and ecocide. Industrial animal farming and its driving force, carnism, does not only cause suffering for billions of sentient beings every year, but it also contributes to climate change, it decimates wildlife, contributes to the extinction crisis, it pollutes the air, the land, and water, it exposes humans to foodborne pathogens, and because of its inefficiency and unsustainability, it plays a role in global food insecurity. The scale of this industry, the sophistication of technologies facilitating extraction and murder, and the intensity of animal suffering from confinement, torture, and killing are all unprecedented today. I'll offer just one example. Just in the US in 2017, the meat industry processed, I will note here the semantic laundering, processed replaces killed, nearly 9.5 billion animals just in one country, just in 1 year. The broken lives of sentient beings are reduced to mere digits, and non-human suffering is invisibilized while humans become desensitized by aggregates. The brutality of industrial animal farming is synergistic, of course, with other industries dedicated to harm and killing, the weapons industry in particular. Here we find advanced technologies of violence, which allow the massive scale and efficiency of killing, and they also, of course, distance physically and psychologically the killer from the killed. The intersection here between these two industries of violence, industrial animal farming and the weapons industry, echoes my earlier observation on wildlife trafficking, which is often embedded in transnational criminal networks, also involved in weapons, drugs, and human trafficking. Both industrial animal farming and wildlife trafficking embody the sinister necropolitics agendas of states, corporations, and criminal networks. Death and killing are not limited to the billions of farmed animals. Their suffering also leads to other forms of suffering, killing, and death. Meat production contributes itself to the extinction crisis, while, as we saw earlier, when it comes to wildlife trade, the tie between this trade and environmental destruction is more direct. When it comes to industrial animal farming, it indirectly impacts biodiversity loss because in many parts of the world, forests are wiped out to make room for meat, dairy, egg, and leather production. And an estimated 80% of deforestation globally is a result of agribusiness. Since the livestock sector is the single largest anthropogenic user of land, this industry impacts wildlife depending on the integrity of land, water, and air to survive. Animal agriculture is the leading cause behind this environmental crisis due to its role in climate change and air pollution, water depletion and pollution, alongside its impact on biodiversity loss. Therefore, the impact is not limited to the suffering of farmed animals, but it also in many ways contributes to the suffering of wild animals. There are, of course, many other aspects which I don't have time to get into now, such as soil degradation from fertilizers and pesticides, the massive growth of monocrops, water depletion, and many other aspects which cumulatively contribute to ecocides. But when it comes to both industrial animal farming and wildlife trade, we witness how speciesism and carnism leads to large-scale theriocide or animal killing. I will now move to a brief discussion of why industrial animal farming and wildlife trade are embodiments of this continuum between genocide and ecocide. This approach contrasts their current legal status, which permits the majority of killing and only restricts narrow insignificant portions of it, and altogether ignores the externalities of the process, such as I was mentioning earlier, the genocide of farmed animals, leading in some cases indirectly to genocide and ecocide when it comes to wild animals and plants. I look at both industrial animal farming and wildlife trade as violating animal rights, not only the limited rights legally recognized by a few jurisdictions, but also the expansive rights animals should universally have. As sentient beings, many non-humans can feel pain and they avoid harm and death. They seek safety and comfort by building homes. They nurture and defend their families, and they contribute to social networks of their own species and to complex ecological processes between different animal and plant species. They have identities as distinct individuals. No two animals are identical in their physical characteristics or personality, and as distinct species. The expansive rights I hypothesize here should be predicated on an awareness of these identities, needs, abilities, and contributions. From this flows my argument that a massive killing of farmed and freeborn animals manifests as genocide. The 1948 UN Genocide Convention defines genocide as, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. We notice here that a focus is on identity. Individuals are not randomly targeted, but they're victimized because of their membership to a group. I would argue that this applies to our treatment of animals in the context of industrial animal farming and wildlife trade. Certain animals are unmasked, confined, tortured, killed because of their characteristics, and therefore identity serves us. We don't farm all or any animals. We predominantly farm a few species like chicken, turkeys, pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats considered fit for consumption. Similarly, we don't abduct and exploit any freeborn animals, but a select few whose bodily characteristics fit our consumer needs, whether it's carnism pushing us to consume their body, or it's voyeurism or exoticism driving our need to watch or own unusually looking rare animals. Returning to the Genocide Convention, acts included under genocide are killing members of the group, causing them serious bodily or mental harm, imposing on them living conditions calculated to physically destroy the group in whole or in part, preventing births, and forcibly transferring children out of the group. Again, just like with the identity criterion discussed earlier, I believe these genocide criteria also apply to industrial animal farming and wildlife trade, since in different forms, all acts described above are routinely inflicted on domesticated and wild animals. Various scholars and activists have critiqued the narrowness of the current legal regime around genocide. However, these critiques only or primarily discuss the human victims left outside the current conceptualization of genocide. I find that less attention has been devoted to how our beliefs, institutions, and industries and technologies are dedicated to the systematic annihilation of non-humans, and how the tragedy endured by billions of non-human sentient beings could itself be a form of genocide. Since genocide designates annihilation driven by identitarian considerations, a significant omission here is perhaps that belonging to a species is also a form of identity, more fundamental than other identity markers, such as ethnicity, nationality, race, religion, which are now considered under the legal definition of genocide. It seems I only have about 2 minutes left, so unfortunately I'll have to skip the part on ecocide, but the main point on ecocide is that it is not criminalized. So to conclude, we notice that both genocide and ecocide as legal categories come with multiple obstacles for crime prevention, accountability, and repair. While genocide only criminalizes a very narrow portion of harms perpetrated solely against human beings, ecocide is not even criminalized, so invoking ecocide remains perhaps meaningful conceptually and ethically, but devoid of any legal implications. And I believe states should have ample positive and negative obligations towards all sentient beings. And from this perspective, our current harms against other beings should not only be treated as crimes perpetrated by individuals, but also indirectly by states, because not criminalizing a grave harm is itself a form of criminality. I believe this genocide-ecocide continuum, when it comes to industrial animal farming and wildlife trade, is conceptually significant for the future of animal law and animal rights activism, because it shows how these areas can draw on established crimes in international criminal law, such as genocide, and on emergent crimes such as ecocide, ecocide at the intersection of criminal law and environmental law. And overall, probably the inhumane ramifications of speciesism and anthropocentrism are to me reminders that we need to reconsider the meaning of humanity, inhumanity, and animality, and accordingly try to elevate law and everyday ethics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rimona. Our third presenter for this panel is Mark Bubeck from LMU Munich. Mark, okay, you already shared.
Yeah, I shared already. I hope
Yes.
it's fine. Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to present my research here on this conference, and also to the organizers for this inspiring venue. I'm a sociologist and veterinarian myself, and I'm working at the moment at my PhD thesis at the LMU Munich in the Department of Sociology. It is a qualitative approach to research how the killing of animals is differentiated and linked to a professional identity in veterinary medicine in Germany. And this talk is just a small insight in the research because it's still kind of work in progress. Sorry. So, genau. In the conference title referred to the feminist claim, "The personal is political." Veterinary medicine is a good example for this in-between or mixture of these two spheres, because it shows how the human-animal relationships are private and political at the same time. Veterinary medicine can be seen as a triad of relationships between human and other animals and human and other animals. Yeah, so human and other animals, and as well as the institutional and political settings, for example, the EU strategy from farm to fork. Maybe some of you know it is a kind of food security regulation. From an ethical perspective, veterinarians face complex ethical questions and conflicts in their everyday working life, and their primary obligation is unclear. So it's not clear if they are focusing, or their main orientation is towards the animal or towards the clients, the human clients mostly. In my presentation of human killing, classification conflicts in veterinary medicine, I will empirically reconstruct a classification conflict of euthanasia from a bovine veterinary medicine perspective. Using this example, I will show how euthanasia is a humane form of death and is linked to a concept of animal welfare as well as economical reasoning. But let's start with a short introduction in the veterinary medicine as a sociological field of research. There has not been much sociological research of veterinary medicine at the moment, but it is a growing field of study. In practice, veterinarians are not only there to care for animals, but also to kill them. The killing of animals is termed in different ways and associated with different places. For example, it is the slaughtering at the slaughterhouse, or culling during a state control measurement. In the creative area, further disciplinary and local differences become apparent, for example, between so-called farm animals in the stable, or also pets in the clinic of the vet, or in the private houses of the clients. This listing shows how the veterinarian death work, like the sociologist Morris calls it, is embedded in the ambiguous and ambivalent classification and positioning of other animals in society. As I mentioned before, in my PhD project, I follow an integrative study which followed the chronic theory approach to study this death work in veterinary medicine. It is based on 17 semi-structured interviews and a data analysis of guidelines, textbooks, and homepages. Today, I will characterize a classification conflict in one case. The case is a vet who is specialized in bovine medicine, and she called out the ambivalent situation, especially in livestock medicine, between working with sentient beings and on the other side, an economical use of them. She classifies two kinds of different euthanasia, or forms of euthanasia, for animal reasons on one side, and on the other side for economical reasons. At the end, I will show how these justification strategies can conflict with each other, which shows the ambivalent structure of euthanasia, especially in the livestock sector. One reason we heard already some talks about so-called farm animals is their simultaneous position as sentient creatures and as commodities, which the sociologist Rilke described as sentient commodities. And the economic efficiency is a central aspect in this, as the anthropologist Barbara Nosten called it, animal industrial complex. So I now will go to my first, slide, but I will now go to my first case. In the first case, the vet decided to euthanize an animal for economical reasons. And now I will read the quote. And of course, and this must also be said clearly, economic efficiency plays a role too. It's not the case that, as I said before, in the case of a cow, for example, which has a fracture of the femur, that you would build an external fixator on it and then try to remobilize it for 8 weeks in the aqua trainer. Yeah, this animal is simply not worth that much. And I always think that I always find it a bit unfair, I have to say, because it often doesn't correspond to reality, is that the farmer are too quickly accused of, yes, that they do put every animal to sleep. No animal receives medical treatment anyway. That's not true, that's not the case. But the decision to euthanize the animal, as I've already said, will be made faster, but it will be made no less consciously. That's not the case. Because if a treatment is possible, you must see it that way. Then it is also worthwhile for the farmer. In principle, euthanasia is not profitable for the farmer in the end. In bovine medicine, there's a strong restriction of the space of possibility due to economic efficiency, diagnosis or treatment cost, and the value of animals. And the value of animals must be brought into balance. The veterinarian sees her option as more limited compared to companion animal medicine. In her perspective, the decision to kill a cow is made faster, but still consciously. In her understanding, killing with consciousness makes killing humane. She uses an economical calculation to justify the euthanasia. The cost for the farmer to get a cow euthanized is never profitable. In this case, however, the alternative death of the cattle in the animal industrial complex is not named, the killing or slaughtering for food production. Now we'll go to my second case. In addition to economy, animal welfare is a central anchor of the profession as well. For the veterinarian, another kind of euthanasia classification are cases for animal welfare reasons. At the beginning of the segment, consciousness is again an important factor in making killing humane. Here, she discusses the act of killing as a conscious one because she's aware that this is the end of a life. Now I will read the quote. But it's always the case at that moment that you are aware that this is the end of a life. It's not something that bothers me. I would say that burdens me further or something else. What annoys me sometimes are the circumstances that led to the euthanasia because some are unnecessary. That annoys me sometimes. And because it's just like I've already said, euthanasia coming from animal welfare decision is often unnecessary. But because you just know exactly, or maybe because you have already seen how it goes, you then decide that there is no chance for this calf in this situation on this farm. That's something that annoys me then. The killing itself is not an emotional burden for her, but there are cases that annoy her. For example, if an animal must be euthanized for animal welfare reasons, because she sees no chance for the animal in this concrete situation. The assessment of the situation is based on a professional experience. The killing would often be unnecessary if the animal had received adequate care. Animal welfare is seen here as a justification for ending a life unnecessarily, because no alternatives are seen in the agricultural system, for example, the dislocation to another place. In both cases of legitimizing strategies for economic or for animal welfare reasons, it is apparent to the decision to euthanize an animal can be challenging to the veterinarian. In my last quote, I would like to show how this can be conflicted or even in a broader spectrum. Therefore, in my last quote, I would like to turn to the emotional aspect of the relationship, but this time of the one from the client to the animal. I read my quote. I once had a slightly older farmer who had won a cow which had a very, very severe ketosis. And just in the context of this ketosis also then at some point so bad in such a way, yes, the farmer always called it a liver coma, and then it could no longer be saved. And we decided to euthanize this animal. And this farmer then also put a halter on the cow, the way you do that with a lying cow. And he pulled his head around to tie that head on the hind leg so that you get access to the cervical vein. And he finished it all up and then said to me, "I'm leaving now." And then I said, "Yes, that's okay." And then he stood afterwards he stood next to my car and said to me, "I had this animal for 15 years. I know I know each of its quirks. I don't want to see it." That's always what I think. So on the one hand, it just refers to the relationship, which still are there despite the economic efficiency that you have to keep in mind, and it makes the whole thing humane. Within the narration of this specific case, a differentiation between decision making and on the other side, practical enforcement become more noticeable. I have shown how the decision must be conscious on a conscious one to be humane. Practices and methods are another important discourse about humane killing, which I can't address further in my talk. To end my presentation, I want to stress the emotional aspect of the interspecies relationship. The animal is considered as an individual and a subject by the farmer, with whom a long-term relationship existed. This reminds me of the attachment from Wilkie's work. Because of their relationship, the farmer decided against being present for the killing. The vet describes this relationship despite the economic efficiency. For her, this makes the whole situation a humane one. So what does it mean? Veterinarians are embedded in different, sometimes conflicting worlds with different orientation. This could be animal-orientated or welfare-orientated or economical reasons, and it's not clear to which part they belong. Are they more in the interest of the animal, or are they in the interest of the owner? As I have shown, the classification system of different forms of euthanasia is challenged by the actual vet practice, and its boundaries are often blurred. Due to ambivalent position of the veterinarians, the question remains challenging. Which kind of death is human, in whose opinion? So thank you very much for your attention. I was a little bit fast.
Thank you, Mark. I was thinking during all of your wonderful talks about how all three topics can be viewed as position on a continuum, with animal industry on one side, activism on the other, and veterinary somewhere in between them. And at the same time, they share similar aspects. And now I'm happy to introduce our discussant, cultural anthropologist, Dr. Elan Abrel from Wesleyan University. Elan, you can start.
Hi, Thank you. I totally agree with what Limor said about the papers, and I'll try to elaborate a little bit. So thank you all for these wonderful, thought-provoking papers. Rather than respond to each one separately, I'd like to try to bring them into conversation with each other a bit and focus on some themes and concerns that they share, or at least that I saw in them. So like the panel title says, these papers are all concerned with ethical considerations about how we treat animals in the Anthropocene, which is an epoch not just marked by the geologically measurable impact of humans on the planet's life systems, but specifically human impacts that have led to a conflagration of multiple mutually accelerating mega crises. Sociologist Danielle Sellermeyer describes these current crises, such as climate catastrophe and biodiversity collapse, as omnicide, an overdetermined killing of all life, in which every aspect and actor of our global capitalist political economy is complicit. So while there are multiple factors contributing to this omnicide, many of them alone, given enough time, might be able to accomplish the killing of everything on their own, like the fossil fuel industry. But humans are ensuring the hastening destruction of planetary life several times over, like sort of the gang of Roman senators stabbing Julius Caesar to death. In industrial animal agriculture, which Rimona and Mark's papers address, and I think Anna's papers also implicitly relevant too, is one of these daggers. The omnivore's dilemma has become the omnicidaire's dilemma. So I see all three of these papers as working through various ethical considerations about how to at least curtail some of these crises or ameliorate some of the impacts. So each paper considers in different ways how anthropocentric speciesist systems of exploitation and resource extraction help maintain and perpetuate a passive complicity with these systems. As Anna shows, unself-reflective speciesist value hierarchies even impact the perspectives and actions of animal activists, causing the needs of some species to be overlooked or neglected. Mark shows how veterinarians make or arguably rationalize decisions about euthanasia through conflicting frames of economic efficiency and animal welfare, but ultimately continue to participate in and support the work of the animal agriculture industry that creates the wholly unnecessary conditions under which they make these decisions about animal life and death. And Rimona highlights connections between genocide and ecocide, and I might say a little more than she was able, I might reference a little more than she was able to say in her presentation, because I had the privilege of reading the whole paper, which is excellent. And so she calls for a recognition in international law of ecocide as a crime on par with genocide to end the legal legitimization of profit-generating acts of ecocide like industrial animal agriculture and the wildlife trade, or at least the dimensions of it which are in the legal market. So in her paper, Rimona discusses a useful concept that I think could apply to all of these contexts, and that's the idea of unseen. So she references how in some of her other work, she examines the politics of unseen in contexts of violence and exploitation directed against humans, and how these actions are invisibilized, drawing parallels to the ways in which systemic violence against animals and the destruction of the environment are also invisibilized. Further, she points out our collective failure to end these systems while continuing to benefit from them makes us all complicit. As she writes, whether genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, or Theriocide, murder of animals, and ecocide complicitly breeds rationalization. And I think that this is an observation that applies to all three papers, or is relevant to all three papers, this idea that participation or complicity leads to forms of rationalization. So what do we do about it? How do we break that complicity and expose the sort of grotesque irrationality of these systems? I see each paper as implicitly pointing out the need for a fundamental paradigm shift in how we see and respond to these problems. But what would such a paradigm look like? Raphael Lemkin worked for years to secure the recognition of genocide in international law, which was arguably an incredibly significant paradigm shift in the way the international community understood such atrocities. But decades later, we can tragically count many genocides that have been allowed to unfold since he first achieved that. So I give that example to just ask or encourage people to ponder what a paradigm shift might actually look like versus something that could easily be co-opted by the system and not achieve the kind of change that we might want. So on that note, I want to wrap up with a question for the panelists to respond to, or can choose not to respond to. So in the context of each of your papers, can you think of ways in which it might be possible to affect shifts in understanding that could truly disrupt or transform the destructive systems of violence and exploitation that are driving omnicide? And maybe the answer is no, or maybe you disagree that a paradigm shift is necessary. But it would be interesting to hear your responses in that regard as well then. So thank you.
Thank you, Elan. Who would like to refer to that question, if you would?
Well, if you want to, I can jump in.
Yeah.
I obviously do not have the response for that. I think it's a very loaded question, but thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for bringing all the papers together. I know it is always a bit of a challenge, and I very much appreciate the work. I can't really respond for final because it is difficult to say what would work or what not. In the end, I think we still have a systemic problem much more than an individual problem. So We have to look at the system as a whole and less at individual people groups or individual cultures, subcultures, or even necessarily nationalities. Obviously, every culture will have an individual approach based on an educational background, the way education is organized in the country and so on. But I do actually believe that is the point where we should start. That would be education. It is very hard, as usual, to change the existing society. And I believe the earlier we start, the easier on one hand. So including teaching about this, including this in schools, starting early to bring an awareness to children would, as in most matters with animals, be probably helpful. And additionally, based on my talk and my experience also with the animal activists, it's even if people have the wish to do good, it sometimes is just not enough because we don't know enough. And it's not just the fact that financial funding might not be there, but that we are really going in with the best of our ideas and intentions, but they are our ideas. And we would need some kind of way to double check those. How exactly to create this is a little bit more problematic. Taking this example of animal activism, it might need more ethical boards, it might need more working together with actual natural sciences, with behavioral biology, and so on. But you'd have to take a look in specific surroundings and probably find specific solutions for specific environments on the other hand. So on one hand, a very general approach, trying to include society and raise an awareness. On the other hand, finding really specific solutions and making sure that a lot of these things don't just go unsupervised, which is hard because you do not want to discourage people, of course. But on the other hand, if the knowledge or the scientific background is missing, then we can see that sometimes it may even be more problematic and actually help the case. But of course, it's quite a big taking on to find a solution for this. But maybe just two or three ideas from my side.
Maybe I can jump in with the scientific knowledge, because I think veterinary education should have quite a lot of scientific science of animals. And I think like there are two brilliant studies of veterinary education from Nadine Dolby, Learning Animals. They're both placed in the US, but that's the one. And she has an interview study over the course of the veterinary education, and so she can really look in how are they changing their views on animals and what are the studies doing with the people who going into the field, and often with a kind of I love animals, I want to help animals. And she can show like in US they have a tracking system, which is the other study where Milga writing about. Like they have this different courses for companion animals and for large animals, and then for food animals as well. And she shows like they are kind of reproducing the logics of differentiation and positioning for different animals. So I think like for veterinary education, we would need a shift in the education itself. And I hope like if there is a field coming like veterinary humanities, or the humanities are more going into the medicine science, that then there will be kind of a change of the system, or a more critical approach to systematical questions.
Rimona, would you like to say something about it?
Yeah, I think the problem is not necessarily the scarcity of information, because there's probably enough research out there for all of us to already know about sentience, to know that the animals we eat and wear are sentient beings, and that the way we treat animals contributes to the environmental crisis, and it contributes to zoonosis and anthroponosis and everything else. I think I see it more as a crisis of feeling than a crisis of knowing, and I'm not sure how to effect change. I think it's easier to think that offering more information will make a change. The problem is, how do you shift the way people feel and act every day? Because you can feed people more information, more research papers, more vegan advocacy and so on, more animal rights advocacy, but that doesn't mean they will feel differently or act differently. So I don't know what the solution is in that regard. I think there are reasons to be optimistic because we live in times of unprecedented learning and change, but we also live amid times of unprecedented brutality and denial. So these realities coexist, whether it's the way we oppress human beings or animals. It manifests in a similar way. One approach in recent years, which might be effective, I've noticed animal rights organizations, and I think it's called the Center for Effective Vegan Advocacy or something like that. I think it's like a sister organization of Beyond Carnism, the organization founded by psychologist Melanie Joy, who introduced the term carnism. I get all these newsletters explaining you how to talk in a compassionate way about veganism, not to trigger non-vegans, for instance. And I think that's a useful approach, but at the same time, this perpetual sugarcoating of criminality is very disturbing to me. The fact that the non-violent ones always need to do the extra labor to explain and explain again and insist and again insist, hoping something would change.
Thank you, Rimona. Ilan, would you like to add something to that, or we can move to the next question? Are you unable to mute to unmute again? Okay.
Could I maybe just jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say that Anna had her hand up. That's all.
Okay. Okay, yeah, Anna, I see that you have a question in the chat. Is that?
Oh no, I just wanted to respond
okay,
to the cases, if I may, just really quickly. To Rimona, I just wanted to make sure that I didn't mean more information in that case. I don't think education is necessarily. Of course, we could all. You Google it and you find the solution. You know what it is. If you want to know, you can now as a grown-up. But I do believe if the educational system from the roots on starts, that we can change the mindset with which you approach, and maybe in your case also more the emotion, not hinder emotions so much. It's the same way like we take a look at children's books or similar things. We get we produce and reproduce already from a very stage on a certain meaning with animals. And if we change this a little bit, the media that we consume at that age, the way we get taught in school, the way we interact with animals, for example, with certain species, that there are more species than just a dog at house or the cat at house and so on. I think this might very slowly, of course, but in whole be more useful. There's a ethologist, Karen, I think, Joe, for example, who works with ants, which is a very interesting case, who goes into the kindergarten finally, and she lives with ants in the house, which I found a very interesting case because most people in this regard study more, traditional companion animals, and introduces this to kindergartens finally and to young people's schools and so on. And it changes and shifts really the behavior children show towards even just ants, and the teachers report that afterwards they protect them, they don't step on them and so on, which is of course one specific very ideal example, but maybe something that could just show that there is hope there if we would really make a very systemic change, which in itself is obviously a challenge. And I just had one idea which I wanted to ask Mark about, and that is, I was thinking if maybe in veterinary medicine it's similar to gender medicine now. In human medicine, of course, we start introducing this as a subject more and more gender medicine, and teach doctors more or less now to be more aware of the individual cases. It goes more towards personalized medicine. And maybe we could draw from this and include more humanity, so to speak, into veterinary medicine. Is this something, a direction where you're thinking about in changing the education system there, or the educational approach at the universities? If I just may, I was wondering if this could be a good parallel maybe to imagine.
I can just say a quick answer. Yes, that would be kind of a goal or an aim for the educational studies to change kind of the system, because I think critical thinking is not what is really taught at the moment in veterinary education, at least in Germany.
I have a question for Mark.
Yeah.
I don't know how relevant it is to today's papers, but something in my own life recently has made me wonder about euthanasia when it comes to companion animals. And I was wondering about, I guess, like the ethics and the legal status of euthanizing companion animals where you are, Mark, in the context of your work. It extends to a broader interest I have in the right to die, and not to be killed, but to die when, I guess, when, like for human beings as well, for instance, when illness becomes so severe that exiting this world is is the only escape facilitated by doctors and medicine. Thanks.
So in Germany with the companion animals, it's like we don't have something like in the US, for example. Sorry, all of my the most of the research I read is from the US. It seems like they have the killing shelters where they put healthy animals to death, and that's nothing we have in Germany because it's forbidden from the legal legislation. But at the same time, like we can slaughter animals for food production, or we have the cases of the, what I showed you, all these animal welfare cases, because not in another case or in another setting, these animals could live because they don't have a severe illness, which we normally would discuss for like a terminal ill cat or dog. Then normally, or in an ethical sense, we would call it euthanasia. So I think the veterinarians are the cases I have shown you are in an ethical sense not what we would name euthanasia, but for the veterinarians it's the same. They don't make this kind of ethical distinction between it. But maybe that was not your question. I'm not sure if I answered it.
Thanks for explaining. I'm also just wondering, like, how often do veterinarians actually encounter this, people coming with companion animals for them to be killed? And in regards to what Anna mentioned earlier, I totally agree that education is the way forward. But when we look at how controversial religion or history are in, for instance, even primary education, it's probably, I'm probably not very optimistic that the way we teach kids about animal rights will change anytime soon, when even human history is so disputed.
So it depends for a companion animal, it depends like on the setting. If you have kind of a normal practice where the most of people go to vaccinate or for Entwurmen, sorry, I don't know the English term, but vaccination and other stuff, like not really severe cases, and then they discount it, I don't know, like 5 times a week sometimes. So it really depends on, one called it like they have kind of heavy days when they have 3 cases on a day, but then there are some weeks they don't have any cases. But in clinics, it's even more because they have more severe illnesses or accidents there. So it depends on the structure, but it is a normal, and it is a normal part, and every veterinarian says like, it is part of our job to kill animals. That is what all of my interviews, despite their field, like if they are in laboratory animals, or if they're in companion animals, or if they're working with farm animals, they say like, it's part of our profession to kill animals as well.
We have another question for Mark from Michal. She's asking, can you elaborate on an ethical dilemma that actually changed vet's mind about the profession? What was the critiques point that caused the change, if there was?
So let me think about it. So I don't have any vegan veterinarians in my sample. That's maybe kind of restrained. But I have one veterinarian. She was still, like, her case of the euthanasia was a year ago, and she was still working with it. So in the interview, I had the feeling she's still working on the case. And it was one animal. She she was treating and was trying to help the animal, but in the end, the animal suffered because of her treatment. And then the final decision was to kill the animal. And that was a point where she said, okay, sometimes you just have to stop a case for yourself to protect yourself and kill the animal, and don't extend the suffering, because sometimes you can't say if you're going to cure this animal, or if you're going to produce more suffering on it. So that was one case I had where a veterinarian was thinking about, what can I do and what does it mean for me to, maybe we can talk here with Donna Harry, what is a responsible killing in my profession in this kind of concrete situation where I can't change the system?
Thank you. We have one more question from Anna. She would like to ask Rimona. So Anna, you can read your question.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't sure if we were supposed to post them too. Rimona, I was wondering, I find this a very interesting approach to discuss genocide in this context. And I was wondering why the approach of including animals as a concerned group into the definition of genocide is on a very exciting idea, and on one hand also very promising in regard to possibly changing legislation and so on. To my knowledge, and I'm very much far from an expert here, there are so many definitions out there already of genocide, and quite a few opposing ones. For example, an ongoing debate about including groups based on sexual orientation, based on disabilities, killings in that regard, if they count as genocide or not. I believe there's sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards in that regard. But I was just wondering, do you see this more as a potential for including animals, or more an obstacle? Because we're already struggling to which human groups to include, so to speak, which of course means the definition is very open, and there are opposing opinions. So that might be, on one hand, a possibility to include more non-human groups as well. But on the other hand, it's already so difficult to agree on human groups to include that it might make it easy to attack, or maybe make it very much unwanted to include the additional factor of animals. And I was just wondering if you have an approach to this, or how you would judge this in regard to your work.
Thank you, Anna. I've actually read last year a very interesting book by Benjamin Miches. It's called The Politics of Annihilation, a genealogy of genocide. I reviewed it for a law journal. There he discusses many aspects which you mentioned as well, all the different types of violence, and also the different types of identities left outside the realm of genocide. I feel for me, it's pretty early to get into the nuances. I've only started to think about it since like February this year. So I don't have a lot of background on this topic. In particular, my primary area is transitional justice and Israel-Palestine. So this paper is fairly recent, and it draws on more like my personal life, my relations with animals, and so on. And of course, drawing on my background on genocide and more recently ecocide. I'm not really sure how you would put forward a more concrete proposal for transforming the law, because even when we look at ecocide, proposals to have ecocide criminalized have been ongoing since the 70s, and we still don't have a law criminalizing ecocide. So it's probably even more revolutionary to imagine that one day the massive killing of animals would be recognized as genocide, when, as you say, there are so many types of violence against humans and so many victimized human identities which are not currently included in the definition of ecocide. But for me, this paper, this recent research was more like a thought experiment, and I felt like the main aspect I should focus on is the identity criterion, because again, genocide is conceptualized legally in relation to identity. And we have here ethnicity, religion, and so on. And my argument is, why shouldn't we consider species as a very basic form of identity, and look at how animals are victimized specifically because of their identity, because again, they're not selected randomly, they are selected specifically because of their identity, which means specific physical and behavioral characteristics. But again, it's just a thought experiment for me at this point, and I don't feel I have enough background to understand how legally the regime around genocide or ecocide could be transformed in a way that would at least limit animal suffering. If others have ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Okay, if there aren't any more comments or questions, then I would like to thank Ilan for wonderful insights and for tying together all three talks. And thanks again to the presenters for fascinating talks and enlightening discussion. I'm writing in the chat my email address for anyone who would like to continue the discussion, and I will pass your comments on to the participants. And please join us tomorrow for the second day of the conference, which will engage with the theme Sites of Engagement in the Anthropocene. The day will include a talk by Professor Laurie Gruen, Why Ecofeminism Now? You can find all information on our website and our Facebook event. And FYI, our hashtag in social media is ASIConference 2022. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you tomorrow.